A cold rain battered the streets of Maplewood, Ohio, on April 2, 2025, drumming against the windows of Page's past like a restless heartbeat. Inside, Margaret Reed stood alone, her reflection caught in the streaked glass. A woman of 38 with dark hair pulled back and eyes that still held a flicker of youth, though it was shadowed now, dimmed by 4 years of carrying a grief too heavy to name. She adjusted a stray lock, her fingers trembling just slightly, and let out a slow breath. The bookstore smelled of old paper and dust. A sanctuary she'd built from the ashes of her life after Jake, her son, was taken from her in a car accident that still haunted her dreams. Today, though, she couldn't linger. She turned to Eliza, her young assistant, who was wiping down a shelf with a rag, her ponytail bouncing as she hummed softly. "I'm closing up early," Margaret said, her voice quiet but steady. "Vanessa's wedding's this afternoon." Eliza's face lit up, her brown eyes wide with excitement. "Oh, Margaret, you must be so proud, your little sister, the bride. It's like a fairy tale, isn't it?" Margaret managed a faint smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. Proud? The word felt hollow, a stranger in her mouth. Vanessa was marrying Ryan Foster, the golden son of Maplewood's wealthiest family, a man whose name carried weight in every corner of this small town. But Ryan was more than that to her. He'd been her rock, her quiet companion in the bookstore's dim corners after closing, sharing stories of Jake over cups of lukewarm coffee. Vanessa didn't know. No one did. Margaret's gaze drifted to a small wooden box on the counter. Inside, The Boy Who Counted Stars, Jake's favorite picture book, its pages worn from his little hands. She'd wrapped it as a gift for Ryan, a piece of her heart she wasn't sure she could give away. Her fingers brushed the lid, hesitating, then pulled back. The rain pounded harder, a mournful rhythm, as she locked the door behind her and stepped into the storm. Margaret's boots splashed through puddles as she hurried home, the rain soaking her coat and chilling her skin. She pushed open the door of her modest house, the warmth inside a stark contrast to the cold she carried in her bones. Her parents were already there, waiting in the living room like statues carved from judgment. Karen Reed sat on the sofa, her 60-year-old frame draped in an elegant dress, a pearl necklace gleaming at her throat, a prize she'd bought with years of clawing for respectability. Thomas stood by the window, his black tuxedo stiff and uncomfortable, his broad shoulders hunched as if the weight of his construction empire still pressed on him even in retirement. "Finally," Karen said, her voice sharp as she glanced at her watch. "We leave in an hour. Don't cause any problems today, Margaret." Her eyes flicked over her daughter, lingering on the damp coat, the plainness of her. "The Fosters can't know about your situation." The words landed like a slap. A single mother, a dead son, a stain on their polished family name. Thomas cleared his throat, his gruff voice low. "Just behave, Margaret. It's Vanessa's day." Margaret's hand tightened around her phone, Jake's smiling face glowing on the screen. 7 years old forever, his grin a lifeline she clung to. "I'll try," she whispered, more to herself than to them. Upstairs, she slipped into a simple gray dress, the fabric cool against her skin, and paused by her nightstand. The box sat there, The Boy Who Counted Stars hidden inside. Her chest ached. Should she bring it? The question gnawed at her as she descended the stairs. The family car waited outside, engine humming, and they piled in. Karen in the front, Thomas at the wheel, Margaret in the back with her handbag pressed against her side. The silence was suffocating, thick as the fog rolling over the road. Karen adjusted her hair, her voice cutting through the quiet. "Stay invisible with the Fosters, Margaret. They're the most respected family in town." Thomas grunted, eyes fixed ahead, the dashboard blinking a warning. "Low gas." "We'll stop at the Shell," Karen sighed, and Margaret stared out the window, the rain streaking the glass like tears she couldn't shed. She was a shadow in this car, a ghost in her own family, and the weight of it pressed harder with every mile. The Shell gas station loomed out of the rain like a forgotten relic, its cracked pumps rusting under a flickering neon sign that buzzed faintly in the dusk. The Reed family car rolled to a stop, tires crunching gravel, and Margaret felt the air in the backseat grow heavier, the silence between her parents a wall she couldn't breach. Karen's voice sliced through it, sharp and impatient. "We're low on gas. Thomas, fill it up." He nodded, stepping out into the wind, his tuxedo jacket flapping as he wrestled with the pump. Margaret's chest tightened, she needed to escape even for a moment. "Restroom," she muttered, pushing the door open before anyone could reply. The cold bit at her skin as she hurried across the lot, her gray dress clinging to her legs, damp from the earlier downpour. Inside the restroom, the mirror was grimy, streaked with years of neglect, and her reflection stared back, tense, tired, a woman unraveling at the edges. She splashed water on her face, the chill jolting her awake, and whispered to herself, "Just a few more hours. You can do this." Her hands shook as she smoothed her hair, Jake's face flashing in her mind, his giggle, his small hand tugging at her sleeve. She stepped back outside, the wind howling louder now, and froze. The car was gone. Her breath caught, a sharp stab in her chest. She scanned the lot, empty, desolate, the black sedan vanished as if it had never been there. Her phone buzzed in her hand and she fumbled to unlock it, heart pounding. Vanessa's text glowed on the screen, "I'm the only star today." Then Karen's, "Now we're all family." The words hit like a punch, stealing the air from her lungs. She dialed Thomas' voicemail. Karen voicemail. Her handbag with her wallet, her cards, everything was still in the backseat. 50 miles from the venue, stranded, the wind tearing at her dress, she sank onto a splintered bench, her legs giving out. Jake's laugh echoed in her ears, a cruel memory, and tears spilled down her cheeks, hot against the cold. They'd erased her, left her behind like a discarded thing, and the realization crushed her. A low rumble broke through the wind and headlights pierced the growing dark. A truck screeched into the lot, its tires spitting gravel. Margaret wiped her eyes, her pulse quickening as the driver stepped out, a grizzled man with a stained jacket and a leer that made her skin crawl. "Lost, sweetheart?" he drawled, his breath reeking of whiskey as he lumbered closer. She clutched her phone, the battery icon blinking at 5%, her only lifeline slipping away. "I'm fine," she said, her voice trembling, but he didn't stop, his shadow falling over her. "Don't look fine to me." Her heart slammed against her ribs. Alone, defenseless, the station's attendant nowhere in sight. She bolted to the payphone by the pumps, her dress catching on the bench, tearing slightly. The man laughed, a low, guttural sound, and followed at a slow pace, his boots thudding on the concrete. She fumbled coins borrowed from the reluctant attendant into the slot, her fingers shaking so badly she nearly dropped them. The line rang and Ryan's voice answered, calm but edged with concern. "Margaret." "They left me," she choked out, her throat tight with panic. "Shell Station, Highway 12. Please." Silence stretched, then his voice sharpened, furious. "I'm coming. Don't move." She glanced back. The trucker was closer now, leaning against a pump, watching her with a smirk. Her breath fogged the glass booth, her hands pressed against the cold metal, every second a lifetime as she prayed for those headlights to come. The wait felt endless, the wind rattling the booth, her phone dead in her pocket now. The trucker lingered, lighting a cigarette, the flame casting shadows across his face. Margaret's chest heaved, her mind racing. 50 miles, no money, no way out. Then a roar cut through the dusk. Ryan's silver sports car tore into the lot, gravel flying as it skidded to a stop. He stormed out, his normally calm features twisted with rage, his suit jacket whipping in the wind. The trucker straightened, sizing him up, but Ryan didn't hesitate. He crossed the distance in seconds, pulling Margaret into his arms, his grip fierce and protective. "You're safe now," he said, his voice low, trembling with barely contained fury. She clung to him, her tears soaking his shirt, the warmth of him a shield against the cold. He glared at the trucker, who shrugged and slunk back to his rig, muttering under his breath. Ryan guided her to the car, his hand steady on her back, and slid into the driver's seat. As they peeled out, tires squealing, he gripped the wheel, knuckles white. Margaret pulled her phone from her pocket, showing him Vanessa's text. "She knew," she whispered, her voice breaking. His jaw tightened, a muscle ticking in his cheek. "She'll answer for this," he said, his words a promise, dark and unyielding. The rain had stopped, a cruel sun breaking through the clouds, glinting off her soaked dress and the small paper bag in her lap. Jake's book, the only thing she'd kept. She clutched it, a lifeline in the storm brewing inside her as they sped toward the reckoning ahead. The silver sports car roared up to the wedding venue, a grand cathedral of white stone and cascading flowers that glowed under the late afternoon sun, its beauty a cruel contrast to the storm raging inside Margaret. Ryan killed the engine, his hands still tight on the wheel, his breath sharp and uneven. She sat beside him, her gray dress damp and torn at the hem, Jake's book clutched in her lap like a shield. The parking lot was a sea of luxury cars, a testament to the Foster family's influence, and the hum of 200 guests drifted through the open doors. Laughter, music, the clink of glasses. Margaret's stomach twisted, her fingers trembling as she smoothed her hair, trying to piece herself back together. Ryan turned to her, his hazel eyes fierce with a fire she'd never seen before. "You don't have to do this," he said, his voice low, almost pleading. But she shook her head, her throat tight. "I do. For Jake." He nodded, a muscle ticking in his jaw, and stepped out, rounding the car to open her door. She took his hand, her legs unsteady as they crossed the threshold. The coordinator, a young woman in a crisp blazer, froze mid-step, her clipboard slipping slightly. "Mr. Foster. They said Miss Reed wasn't coming." Ryan's voice cut like steel. "She's family. She sits in front." Margaret felt the weight of eyes on her as they moved through the foyer. Guests whispering, heads turning, her soaked appearance a stark blemish against the polished crowd. Her parents sat in the front row, Karen's pearl necklace catching the light, Thomas's broad frame rigid beside her. They saw her and their faces shifted. Karen's smile went brittle, Thomas's eyes darted away. "Ryan," Karen started, rising with forced grace. "It's bad luck too." He cut her off, his tone icy. "What's bad luck is abandoning your daughter." The words landed like a thunderclap and the hall fell silent, every gaze locked on them. Margaret's heart pounded as Ryan led her down the aisle, his grip on her hand firm, unyielding. The guests parted like a wave, their murmurs rising into a low buzz, shock, curiosity, judgment. She felt exposed, raw, her dress clinging to her skin, her hair a mess of wet strands. Vanessa emerged from a side door, a vision in white, her wedding gown shimmering with delicate lace, but her face crumpled when she saw them. "Ryan," she gasped, her voice a mix of fear and confusion. "Why with her?" Her blue eyes darted to Margaret, wide and pleading, mascara already smudging at the corners. Before Ryan could answer, a shout erupted from the reception desk at the back of the hall. "The groom's canceling it," a staff member yelled, his voice cracking with panic. He said, "No Margaret, no wedding." Gasps rippled through the crowd, chairs scraping as people turned to stare. James Foster, Ryan's father, stormed forward, his silver hair gleaming under the chandeliers, his strong jaw set in fury. "What the hell is this, Ryan?" he demanded, his voice booming over the chaos. Ryan faced him, unflinching, his arms still around Margaret. "I came to marry Vanessa," he said, his words deliberate, cutting through the noise. "But marriage isn't just two people, it's family. Margaret's been my friend, my strength since Jake died. And they," he pointed at Karen and Thomas, his voice rising, "left her like trash at a gas station 50 miles away with nothing." Vanessa sobbed, her hands clutching her veil, tears streaking her face. Karen lunged from her seat, her voice a hiss. "You've ruined us, Margaret." Margaret flinched, but Ryan stepped between them, his presence a wall. Thomas cleared his throat, his gruff voice barely audible. "It wasn't just shame." Margaret's head snapped to him, her breath catching. "What?" The air in the private chamber felt thick, suffocating as Ryan slammed the door behind them, shutting out the chaos of the hall. Vanessa collapsed onto a velvet chair, her white gown pooling around her, her sobs shaking her slender frame. Margaret stood frozen, her hands clenched into fists, Jake's book still pressed against her chest. Ryan towered over them, his rage a palpable force, his eyes locked on Vanessa. "Explain," he said, his voice low and dangerous. She looked up, her face a wreck of tears and guilt, and the words spilled out like a dam breaking. "It's about Jake," she wailed, her voice cracking. "Amanda was driving. She was drunk." Margaret's knees buckled, the room tilting as the truth hit her, a jagged blade twisting in her gut. Ryan caught her, his arms strong around her, keeping her upright. "Amanda." Margaret rasped, her voice barely a whisper, the name a poison on her tongue. Vanessa nodded, her hands trembling as she clutched a tissue. "My friend from college. Her father buried it, said it'd ruin us all. Mother knew." The memory flashed, Karen's stiff hug at Jake's funeral, her eyes averted, her silence a wall Margaret could never climb. "You let me grieve alone," Margaret said, her voice rising raw with fury. "For reputation?" Vanessa reached for her, desperate. "I hated myself every day, Margaret. I couldn't face you. Ryan's face darkened, his fists clenching at his sides. This is criminal, evidence tampering, obstruction. Margaret pulled free of his grip, stepping toward Vanessa, her eyes burning. You think guilt excuses this? We're not done here. Her voice was steel, forged in 4 years of pain, and the room trembled with the weight of what was still to come. The private chamber felt like a tomb, the air thick with Vanessa's sobs and the weight of her confession. Margaret stood trembling, Jake's book pressed against her chest, its edges digging into her skin as if it could hold her together. Ryan's shadow loomed beside her, his silence a storm waiting to break. Vanessa's words, "Amanda was drunk, mother knew," echoed in Margaret's skull, each syllable a fresh wound. She stared at her sister, her voice a ragged whisper. "You hid this for 4 years?" Before Vanessa could answer, Thomas cleared his throat, his gruff voice cutting through the tension like a dull blade. "There's more," he said, his hands fumbling in his tuxedo pocket. He pulled out a crumpled photo, its edges worn, and held it out with a trembling hand. Margaret snatched it, her breath catching as she saw Jake, laughing, alive, sitting in the passenger seat of Amanda's car, the timestamp glaring in the corner, hours before the crash. "I found this in her glove box," Thomas muttered, his eyes fixed on the floor. "After the accident. I kept it, to protect us." The room spun, Margaret's knees buckling again, but this time she caught herself, her fingers curling around the photo until it creased. "For years," she choked, her voice rising into a scream. "You hid this while I blamed myself? While I thought it was just fate." Karen lunged from her chair, her pearl necklace swinging wildly. "Give it back, Margaret. You don't understand." Margaret shoved her away, her strength fueled by rage, and Karen stumbled, clutching the wall. Ryan stepped forward, his voice cold as ice. "This is evidence, criminal evidence." Vanessa wailed. "I didn't know about the photo." The door burst open and Amanda stumbled in, her bridesmaid dress askew, mascara streaking her face. "It's not what you think," she cried, but Margaret lunged, her hands clawing at Amanda's veil. "You killed him." Security rushed in, pulling her back, but the photo slipped from her grasp, fluttering to the floor, a silent scream amid the chaos. Margaret's chest heaved as she broke free of the guards, her eyes locked on Amanda across the hall. The wedding guests scattered, their whispers a rising tide, shock, horror, disbelief. Amanda stood by the altar, laughing nervously with a cluster of bridesmaids, oblivious until Margaret's voice cut through the air like a gunshot. "You," she screamed, charging forward, her torn dress trailing behind her. She grabbed Amanda, tearing the veil from her head, the fabric ripping with a sickening sound. "I didn't mean to." Amanda shrieked, collapsing to her knees, her blonde hair spilling over her face like a shroud. "It was an accident." Margaret's hands shook, poised to strike again, but security yanked her back, pinning her arms. Karen surged forward, her voice a venomous hiss. "She's lying, all of this is lies." But Thomas stepped into the fray, his broad frame trembling, his voice breaking. "No. I saw the car that night. I knew." The hall fell silent, a collective gasp sucking the air from the room. Margaret turned to him, her eyes wide with betrayal, tears streaming down her face. "You knew." The whispers erupted into chaos, guests shouting, the Fosters huddling in confusion. Margaret staggered toward the exit, the world blurring around her, the rain outside calling her back into its embrace. Ryan followed, his footsteps heavy, and pressed Jake's book into her hands, her bag retrieved from the car, a small mercy. "We'll get justice," he said, his voice a vow, fierce and unshaken. Vanessa stumbled out after them, her white gown soaked and clinging to her, her face a mask of anguish. "Margaret, I'll testify, I swear." The words hung in the air, fragile and desperate, as the rain pounded down once more. Margaret stood in the downpour, the photo clutched in one hand, Jake's book in the other, the rain mixing with her tears until she couldn't tell them apart. Ryan stood beside her, his suit drenched, his anger a quiet fire that warmed the space between them. Vanessa hovered a few steps away, her sobs lost to the wind, her hands wringing the hem of her ruined dress. "Amanda's still in there," Ryan said, his voice low, his eyes scanning the venue's glowing windows. "We can end this." Margaret's gaze hardened, the photo's edges cutting into her palm, a ticking bomb she wouldn't let go. "She's not walking away from this," she said, her voice steel-forged in pain. "None of them are." Vanessa stepped closer, her voice trembling but resolute. "I'll face it, all of it. I'll go to the police." Margaret turned to her, the betrayal still raw, but something flickered in her sister's eyes. Guilt, yes, but also a spark of redemption. "You'll dig up every lie," Margaret said, her words a command, not a request. "Every single one." Vanessa nodded, her shoulders slumping under the weight of her promise. Ryan placed a hand on Margaret's arm, his touch steady, grounding. "We'll do this together," he said, and for the first time that day she felt a thread of hope weave through the wreckage. The trio stood there, a fractured unit bound by truth's jagged edge, the rain washing over them as the night closed in, heavy with the promise of what was still to come. The wedding shattered like glass that night, the cathedral's glow fading into a blur of flashing police lights as Amanda was dragged away mid-ceremony, her bridesmaid dress tangled around her wrists, her screams echoing through the stunned crowd. Margaret watched from the sidelines, rain-soaked and hollow, Jake's photo and book clutched in her hands as the truth spilled out into the open. The photo leaked online within hours, a wildfire of outrage spreading through Maplewood and beyond. Hashtags, headlines, a town torn apart. Vanessa stood by her promise, trading her white gown for a jail jumpsuit, her testimony delivered in a trembling voice that broke the courtroom's silence. Amanda's father, a slick lawyer with a corner office, countersued, claiming the photo was doctored, painting Margaret as a vengeful liar out to destroy his family. The months that followed were a nightmare, trials stretching into late nights, reporters camped outside pages past, the bookstore's shelves gathering dust as legal fees drained her savings. She'd wake to Jake's laugh in her dreams, only to find silence, her pillow wet with tears. April 2026 arrived, gray and heavy, the courtroom packed with faces she barely recognized. The judge's gavel fell like thunder. Amanda guilty of vehicular manslaughter, her father complicit in the cover-up, evidence tampering proven beyond doubt. Margaret's knees buckled, Ryan catching her as she clutched Jake's book, tears streaming down her face, a sob breaking free. Vanessa approached, free now but fragile, her eyes red-rimmed. "I'm selling everything," she said, her voice steady despite the tremble in her hands. "My inheritance, the house, it's all going to Jake's scholarship." Margaret's breath caught, a question forming. "Why?" Vanessa met her gaze, unflinching. "Because I owe him. And you." Ryan stepped up, cradling their infant son, Elliot, in his arms. "We're in too," he said, his voice soft but firm. "The library's fully funded." The weight of their words settled over her, a fragile light piercing the dark. The courtroom's tension thickened as Thomas took the stand, his broad frame shrunken, his gray hair thinning under the harsh lights. Margaret watched, her heart a knot of dread, sensing something worse was coming. His voice cracked as he spoke, each word a stone dropped into still water. "I drove Amanda home that night," he said, his eyes fixed on the floor. "She was drunk after a party. I thought she'd sleep it off. I didn't know Jake was with her." The gallery gasped, a collective intake of breath that sucked the air from the room. Karen surged from her seat, her scream piercing the silence. "Traitor! You liar!" But Thomas didn't flinch, his shoulders slumping as he turned to Margaret, his face crumpling. "I left her car in the driveway. Jake must have climbed in later. I didn't check. Forgive me, Margaret." The world tilted, her vision blurring as the truth sank in. Her father, the man who'd built her childhood home with his hands, had set the chain that took her son. She staggered back, a cry tearing from her throat, the photo slipping from her grasp to the floor. Ryan pulled her close, his arms a lifeline, his voice a whisper against her ear. "You don't have to forgive him. Not now, not ever." Thomas collapsed onto the stand, sobs shaking his frame, his hands clawing at his face. Vanessa reached for Margaret, but she pulled away, the wound too deep, too fresh. The courtroom faded into a haze, the judge's voice a distant hum, and all she could hear was Jake's laugh, fading into the void her father had left behind. Spring sunlight streamed through the windows of pages past a few weeks later, casting golden beams across a crowd gathered inside. More people than Margaret had seen in years, their voices warm with laughter and hope. Blue ribbons fluttered from the shelves, a star-shaped cake sat on the central table, and a small sign read Jake Reed Memorial Scholarship. Margaret stood at the front, her hands steady now, Jake's book open in her grasp. Vanessa and Ryan stood beside her, Elliot nestled in Vanessa's arms, his tiny fingers brushing the air. "Thank you all for coming," Margaret said, her voice clear though it wavered with emotion. "Today we honor Jake and the courage it took to face the truth." Vanessa stepped forward, her face softer now, a quiet strength in her eyes. "This past year I've learned to own my mistakes," she said, glancing at Margaret. "This scholarship, this library, it's because of my sister's strength." Thomas lingered in the corner, gray and humbled, snapping photos with shaking hands, his first real smile in months, a fragile offering. Karen was absent, divorced and shunned, her rants about disgrace, ignored by a town that had moved on. The Jake Starr's library opened next door, its shelves alive with children's voices, and Margaret sat among them, reading The Boy Who Counted Stars. "And the stars sang back," she finished, her voice breaking as Elliot's hand brushed the page. The room erupted in applause, a tidal wave of joy crashing over her, tears spilling as she looked up, imagining Jake's grin among the stars. "We won," she whispered to him, and for the first time in years she felt whole. This story isn't just about loss. It's about the fight to reclaim what matters, the messy, beautiful struggle to find light in the darkest corners. It's about family, not just the one you're born into, but the one you build from honesty and love. Do you believe forgiveness can heal a wound this deep, or does some pain demand justice over mercy? Leave your thoughts below, yes or no, and if this tale moved you, hit that subscribe button. Let's keep uncovering the stories that matter together.